Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Copperhead Historian and welcome to the first episode of my new series, Monuments Man. Today we're going to be covering this monument, dedicated to the 2nd Connecticut Light Battery. The 2nd Battery, nicknamed Sterling's Battery, was mustered into service on September 10, 1862, and was mustered out of service on August 10, 1865. They were involved in 4 major engagements: the Battle of Gettysburg, the Siege of Fort Morgan, the Siege of Fort Gaines, and the Battle of Fort Blakely. At the time of the engagement here at Gettysburg, these Connecticut men were pretty green, and the second day of battle would be the first time that they saw actual combat. The battery's commanding officer was a former merchant from Bridgeport, Connecticut, Captain John William Sterling, hence the nickname Sterling's Battery. Sterling was born in 1826 or 1827. He was made captain of the battery on July 22, 1862. He would leave the Army on October 18, 1864, after which Captain Walter S. Hotchkiss would take command. Sterling's battery arrived at Gettysburg on July 2nd at about 10:30 a.m., after which they and the 9 batteries they arrived with would rejoin the rest of the Army of the Potomac's artillery reserve under Brigadier General Robert O. Tyler in the fields southeast of the intersection of Granite Schoolhouse Lane and Tawnytown Road. Sterling's battery was positioned to the left of center of the Union line for approximately 56 hours. Sterling's battery consisted of 4 14-pounder James rifles and 2 12-pounder smoothbore howitzers. The battery was 106 men strong and was fairly lucky with casualties, only 3 men slightly injured and 2 missing. 3 of the battery's horses would be killed in the battle, and 1 of their caissons would be destroyed by a Confederate artillery shell. Now for some info on the monument itself. The monument stands at about 4 feet 9 inches. It was placed on the battlefield by the state of Connecticut on July 3, 1888, 25 years after the unit's fateful first engagement. The monument is placed along Hancock Avenue, and it marks the position of Sterling's battery on July 3, 1863, along the Union line of artillery. I'll leave the specific coordinates for the monument in the description. Unfortunately, the monument doesn't have any significant details about the battery's participation in the battle. It only tells when Sterling's battery was mustered in, when it was mustered out, and what engagements the unit was present, all of which are listed on the back of the monument. There is a figure of 2 crossed cannon barrels on the right side, and a depiction of 2 artillery ramrods crossed over a pile of cannonballs on the left. On the front of the monument, there is a stone carving of the state of Connecticut's seal, on which you can see 3 grapevines and a ribbon with the Latin motto Qui transtulit sustenit, which translates to He who transplanted sustains. When you visit this monument, you'll also notice the 2 cannons on either side of the monument. These are 12-pounder howitzers, officially called M1841s. Similar to the ones used by Sterling's battery during the Battle of Gettysburg. You can tell that these cannons are authentic as they bear the bluish-greenish color that most cannons at Gettysburg have. Now, why do they have this color? And why does this signify that they are authentic? Because cannons at the time were predominantly made out of bronze, and over time bronze oxidizes, which is why it has that bluish-green color, somewhat similar to the Statue of Liberty. Now, why was bronze used? Well, for several reasons. First, it is able to sustain the pressure of constantly being fired much better than iron. Second, bronze is much better at withstanding the elements and doesn't rust like iron. Finally, when making a cannon out of bronze, much less metal is needed to produce the weapon as opposed to making it out of iron. Another thing about the cannons on the battlefield is if you look at the muzzle, you can sometimes see their serial numbers and the year they were manufactured. Unfortunately, as you might expect, due to how old many of these cannons are, reading the numbers on the cannons can be very difficult and sometimes impossible because of how faded the text is. As you can see on these cannons, when you look at the text on the muzzle, there are clearly supposed to be words there, but they're almost impossible to read. Now for the full history of the unit. Sterling's battery was raised at Bridgeport, Connecticut from early July to September 10, 1862. On October 15th, the battery left Connecticut on a path to Washington, D.C. They first marched to New York City, where they boarded a train that took them straight to Washington. The battery would stay there until December 12, 1862, when they would be attached to the 2nd Brigade, Casey's Division, Military District of Washington, which was the collection of regiments and batteries designated to protect the capital. They would be given duty at Camp Barry, which was a temporary artillery camp in Washington, in use from 1862 to the end of the war. By January of 1863, the battery had been given duty near Wolf Shoals, Virginia, during which 4 men tragically died of disease. In February, they and all of Casey's division would be attached to the newly formed 22nd Corps, which itself would then be attached to the newly consolidated Department of Washington. In April, the battery would be moved to the Artillery Brigade of Abercrombie's division, 22nd Corps. On June 25th, Sterling's battery would get their chance to see some real combat, and they were moved to Edwards Ferry, Maryland, to join the 2nd Volunteer Brigade as part of the Army of the Potomac's Artillery Reserve. From July 1st through 4th, the unit took part in the Battle of Gettysburg. On July 5th, they would be transferred to Frederick, Maryland. The battery would return to Camp Barry in D.C. 10 days later. Beginning in August, they would be attached to the Department of the East to help monitor the numerous districts and posts of the New England states, as well as New York and New Jersey. On August 15th, the battery would be moved to New York City and would make camp at City Hall Park. They would have duty at various cities within New York, such as Kingston, Albany, Tarrytown, and Troy, until October 15th, when they would return to Camp Barry and be reattached to the 22nd Corps. On January 24, 1864, the battery would be moved to Baltimore, and 3 days later would embark on the steamship Arago, headed for New Orleans, after which they would be moved to Brashear City, Louisiana, now known as Morgan City. In February, they were assigned to be part of the defenses around New Orleans, which had been captured by Union forces on May 1, 1862. They would remain there until June 17th, when they would be moved to Algiers, today a neighborhood within New Orleans, and were attached to the Artillery 4th Division, 13th Corps, Department of the Gulf. On July 31st, they would be removed from their duties on the defenses of New Orleans and would take part in an expedition to Mobile Bay, during which they would see action at the siege of Fort Gaines from August 2nd to 8th, and right after would be present at the Battle of Fort Morgan till August 23rd. The day after, the battery would be assigned duty at the newly captured Fort Gaines until September 8th, when they would return to Algiers. 11 days later, the battery would be back in New Orleans until November 13th, when they would be moved to White River, Arkansas. In December, they would be attached to the Artillery Reserve Corps of the Military Division of West Mississippi, where they would remain until February 1865, when they'd be moved to Fort Barancas in Florida. After their transfer, they would be attached to the 13th Corps, which would remain with the Military Division of West Mississippi for the rest of the war. From March 11th to April 1st, they and their military division would be on an expedition to Fort Blakely in Mobile Bay. On March 27th, they would assist in occupying Kennew Station. On April 1st, the siege of Fort Blakely began, and on April 9th, it was finally captured by Union forces. On April 12th, the battery would take part in the occupation of Mobile, Alabama, after which they would be on duty in Mobile and Selma, Alabama, until mid-July. On July 13th, they would be moved to New Orleans and then on to New Haven, Connecticut. On August 10th, the battery would finally be mustered out of service. In total, the 2nd Connecticut Light Battery had been in service for 1,064 days, had lost 21 men, and had served in 4 major engagements. Although their part in the Battle of Gettysburg was not a major one, The battery's monument on the battlefield stands as a testament that every contribution to the battle ought to be remembered, regardless of how major or minor it may have been. Anyways, that's all for this episode of Monuments Man. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have something I could improve on, please let me know in the comments. Till next time, this is the Copperhead Historian, signing off.